It is June 2nd, and yesterday I finished the first book that I've read in June, and that was The Joy Luck Club by Amy Tan. So it is definitely time to start another vlog-style monthly reading wrap-up. I do these videos every month, and I talk about the books that I read during the month, what I thought of them, if I like them, if I think you should pick them up. I try to talk for only about 5 minutes about each book, and even still, these vlogs are way too long. I also try to talk about the books as soon after I've finished them as I possibly can, and like I said, I finished this book yesterday. I read most of this book in May. I was reading a lot of Asian books because it is Asian and Pacific Island Heritage Awareness Month. I was hoping to read a lot of Asian works, and luckily I did. This one I didn't get to quite finish. I only read about the last 50 pages yesterday. I do think that this one put me in a little bit of a reading slump. I did really enjoy it, but it is not the kind of book that I typically read. So this follows 4 mothers and 4 daughters. The mothers are all Chinese, and they've all come over from China in the early 20th century and then had daughters, and this takes place mostly in San Francisco in the present and in flashbacks to different areas of China. So we first meet June. She is one of the daughters of these women, and her mother, who was part of the Joy Luck Club, all these mothers and women are part of the Joy Luck Club, has recently passed away unexpectedly. So she's reeling from her mother's death, and through that we meet the rest of the characters in the first chapter, and then we go on to learn more about these mothers and these daughters. An intergenerational tale. It has a lot to do with the mother-daughter relationship and the expectations that are put on women in general, but certainly the expectations that mothers put on daughters and how it's very difficult to live up to that. I also think this has a lot to do with like cultural disappointment, like thinking that you are a disappointment to your culture if you were born into another cultural displacement, about how these Chinese women didn't all necessarily want to come to America, didn't all necessarily want to end up in San Francisco, but how they all did. It's told kind of in flashbacks, either to the mother's childhood, to how they ended up leaving China, or to the daughter's childhood and how their relationship with their mothers formed throughout time. I really enjoyed it. I think the writing was very nice and easy to read, and it certainly was, I feel like, one of the earliest and most mainstream books about Chinese immigrants and how immigrating to America and how raising children as Chinese Americans, and especially daughters, were. So I think for all those reasons, it's extremely acclaimed, and it should be, and it was really good. I think the reason that it put me into a reading slump was just because I don't really love intergenerational stories. I struggle a little bit with the mother-daughter relationship. It's not that I don't like reading it, it's just that like there was so much of it in this book that it just didn't hold my attention quite as much as I hoped it would. Now, this wasn't a book that I disliked reading by any means. I'm super glad that I read it, but it was the kind of book that as I was reading it, I was totally engrossed, but then once I put it down, I didn't really want to pick it back up. I've heard from a friend that she has other books that explore the same topic but don't have so many characters, because one of the things that I found very difficult in this book was how many characters there were. Luckily, there was a character map in the beginning, so I was able to look, but I had to look every chapter to see who was who. I couldn't keep them straight in my mind at all. And I think that's partly because of my not really loving stories like this, but I think it also comes with there just being so many characters, and I'm not a big fan of multiple perspectives books either. So my friend was telling me that she has another book that just deals with like one set of mother and daughter and not all the other people, so I think that could be interesting. I love this cover. I found this book like halfway through reading it and decided to switch the editions, so I will be unhauling one copy of this. I read this for my TBR Spin May book, and I'm very happy I did. Let me know if you've read the Joy Luck Club, and let me know what you thought of it. It is June 7th, and yesterday I finished one more book in June. I finished Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. This is a post-apocalyptic during the apocalypse book about a plague that hits the world and wipes out the majority of people living in it. So the world becomes a wasteland. There's no cars, there's no electricity, there's no jobs, everything kind of reverts to a primitive state. And in this book, we go back and forth with some of our main characters before the plague and after the plague, and how they survived and what happened to them in a post-apocalyptic world. The people that we're following are all revolving around one actor who actually died before the plague hit, but we're seeing them as they are connected to him and as they orbit around him pre and post apocalypse. Some of the people that we are following are in a wandering musical and performing troupe who wander around the wasteland that is now the Midwest and perform in various different towns. So it's really interesting. I don't want to say more than that. I went into this pretty much completely blind. The only thing that I really knew about it was that it was a pandemic book and that the pandemic wiped out the population of the world. And that was enough for me. This is a pretty short book. It looks a little bit longer than it actually is because the chapters are extremely short, and there are some even interview chapters or news clippings, things like that, so that makes them even shorter. I have a physical copy of this one, but I actually read it on audio, and it was a really great audio experience. I'm excited to read more Emily St. John Mandel. I really liked the way her writing was very simple, very plain, but very evocative. In some ways, it felt very much like a real history or like a real experience that you were having, even though obviously it's dealing with many unrealistic topics as well as realistic ones. I could see how the pandemic aspects of this book could be triggering for people because a lot of it is reminiscent or reminiscent of the early days of the pandemic, because this was written before the COVID-19 pandemic happened. And then obviously this takes it a lot further, which is interesting because it makes you think oh, this is what could have happened during the pandemic. So during our own actual realistic worldwide pandemic. So I would definitely if you're not prepared to read about that kind of thing, I wouldn't. There's violence in this. There's off-page talk of death. There's on-page deaths. So there's a lot of things that you might want to look at before you read this book, but I really, really enjoyed it. Emily St. John Mandel wrote a couple of books before this, I think 3 or 4, and then she wrote this one. Then she wrote The Glass Hotel, which is somehow tangentially connected to this book, and then she wrote Sea of Tranquility, which is connected to Station 11 and The Glass Hotel. So I'm really excited to read her previous books to see if they are also connected in any way, but definitely to read her next 2 books after this because they're connected in some way. Let me know if you've read Station 11 and what you thought of it. Let me know if you read it pre-pandemic or post-pandemic and how that made you feel. When I read some more, I'll let you know. It is June 9th, and I have finished 4 more books in June, I believe. I have to pull up my Goodreads because a lot of them were on audio, or some of them were on audio, and I want to remember the order in which I read them. The next book that I finished in June, I do have physically. It's The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. This is a collection of short stories. I think they're all feminist fairy tale retellings. This collection came out in 1979, which is the year I was born. This is super famous, and Angela Carter is super famous. She was a British author who wrote multiple different things, but I think she was really well known for rewriting and retelling fairy tales and giving them kind of a horror bent, as well as telling them through a feminist lens. I always hear a ton about her and her work, and especially this collection of short stories on booktube, and so many people who love fairy tale retellings in novels and young adult novels and things like that love her work and cite her as like one of the new generation of fairy tale writers. My friend Isaac had this book, and when I went and visited him in April, I borrowed it. I started reading it in May for Horror Mayhem. Not all of these, I think, are necessarily like horror, but they do have like horror elements, and I think they have elements of things that turn the fairy tale on its head, like parents who in many fairy tales are dead or negligent coming back to save their children, Little Red Riding Hood sleeping with the wolf, Little Red Riding Hood, instead of saving her grandmother, taking her grandmother's possessions, like things like that. So ideas of the fairy tales, instead of just being the cautionary tales that they usually are, or instead of being a make sure you're taking care of your elders kind of tale, or don't cry wolf kind of tale, things like that, like turning them on their head, changing them, giving them kind of a modern lens, but written in a very flowery, classic kind of way to emulate classic fairy tales. While I was reading this, I thought a lot about Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, which I read in May. I even feel like that could have fit into this collection of stories in some ways, and a lot of the language is very similar, very flowery, feels a little outdated. The Bloody Chamber is probably the most horrific, most horror-like, and I have to admit that I did skip one story. I DNF'd one story in this. So there is The Bloody Chamber, The Courtship of Mr. Lion, The Tiger's Bride, Puss in Boots, The Earl King, The Snow Child, The Lady of the House of Love, The Werewolf, The Company of Wolves, and Wolf Alice. So lots of wolf themes, lots of transformation themes, lots of coming of age themes, lots of becoming a woman, menstruation themes, things like that. The story that I DNF'd was Puss in Boots, and the reason that I DNF'd it, and the reason I think that I didn't really get along with this collection as well as I had hoped, is that flowery language. Like, some of the language that she uses is just so over the top, it was almost difficult for me to follow and understand. I did really enjoy The Bloody Chamber. I really enjoyed The Lady in the House of Love and some of the other stories. Some are, Beauty and the Beast sort of retelling. Some are Little Red Riding Hood retelling. Definitely interesting. I'm glad to have read it and see like what the hype was, but I did not like it as much as most people like it, and I did not feel connected to this collection, and I definitely didn't love Angela Carter's writing. Now, I understand that, like, objectively it's beautiful and it's doing something and it is trying to do something. I just personally didn't like it and didn't get along with it. The next book that I finished was Beyond the Gender Binary by Alok Vaid-Menon. This is a very short essay written and read by Alok, and they are a non-binary author, influencer, and fashion mogul. I'm not sure what else. I don't really know anything about them, and I don't know anything about the Pocket Change books, which is what this is part of. So the Pocket Change books are very short, little pocket-sized books that cover topics that are relevant to today, like climate change and the plastic crisis, like immigration and queer rights. I saw this pop up on one of my free audio sites, so I wanted to listen to it. And this is about an hour-long audiobook that Alok reads. Although this is an essay and look at how to get beyond the gender binary, just as it says on the tin, and to stop thinking of our society needing to have a gender binary, why we can get beyond that, and why non-gendered language is beneficial to everyone, not just ourselves. It has a little bit of the history of gender binary and where that comes from. It has a little bit of science about why gender binary doesn't really make sense, and how that is a political and social application that people have put on the world and not necessarily a true thing. It has a little bit of personal story of Alok figuring out that they were non-binary and how they have come to be a non-binary queer positive activist. I did really enjoy this. I think that it was informative. It was definitely an essay that like I didn't need necessarily. Like I already agree with so many of the things that were stated in this essay, but I think that it was presented in a way that maybe I didn't know before, so it did possibly enable me to have some language that I might use for people who question or combat the relevance of non-binary inclusion, how I can back that up with some facts and some statements that Alok includes in their work. The way it's set up is kind of personal story, and then there is almost a Q&A section in the back, or not necessarily Q&A, but A&A. So like where somebody says like, this is how I feel about non-binaryism. It's eroding the nuclear family or whatever stupid thing that people say. And then Alok kind of answers that answer that someone has with like the truth of the matter, and how that obviously non-binary people and queer people and trans people have absolutely nothing against the nuclear family and are not trying to destroy the nuclear family. They have nothing to do with each other, in that everyone can just live their own lives and be happy. I think it was geared a little bit aggressively, and I think this is because as a non-binary person, there's no other way to feel than to feel a little bit combative against the horrible legislation and rumors and destructive lies that people tell about trans folk and about non-binary folk and everything. Like, I don't know if you could write something that isn't a little bit angry about this subject if this subject is affecting you directly. And I don't think that I necessarily could write something, because I do take offense to those things, and I am categorically opposed to the fascist angle that especially like the US right now are taking. And that was actually something really sad about reading Beyond the Gender Binary, because I think it was written in 2020 or 2019, and so much of what Alok was worried about happening that had only kind of started in rumors is now come to pass, that so much legislation against trans and non-binary people have been passed, and the world is so much worse for queer people than it was just a few years ago. It was really, really sad to read, and it was really hard to know that even though this education exists, things haven't gotten better, they've gotten worse. I think it's worth reading. It's only an hour of your time, or if you're reading it physically, I'm sure it's even less than that. The next book that I read in June is 3:10 to Yuma by Elmore Leonard, and this is a very short story, a Western. It is June on the Range this month, so I did want to read some Westerns. This is about he's not a bounty hunter, I don't know what you call it in the Old West. Similar to a bounty hunter, he is a person that works for a larger government that tracks down criminals and brings them to justice. So he is taking a young man who you don't exactly know all the bad things he's done, but you know that he's bad, from one area of Arizona to another area of Arizona, and they are taking the train, the 3:10 to Yuma. While they're waiting for the train, they're holed up in a hotel room. And so our main character, who is, let's call him a sheriff. He's not a sheriff, but let's call him a sheriff, has to keep this young man safe so that he can serve his sentence and so that he can pay for his crimes. There are people out to get him. They know where he's going to be, so, you know, they're seeking revenge on the young criminal's cohorts who are trying to rescue him. It's just a very short story. The audio is only 30 minutes about this little slice of time while these men are waiting to take the train and all the different things that happen to them. It definitely is fast-paced, exciting, but gives you that real true like Western feel. This was read by Henry Rollins, who is kind of a jerk, but I do have a soft spot for, I guess, because I do love Black Flag and punk rock. This was super fun, super fast-paced. I liked it. I think if anything, it was maybe a little too short, and it was hard to grasp on audio everything that happened. I think if I had read it physically, it would have been a little bit easier for me to connect with. The next book that I read in June is Darius the Great is Not Okay by Adib Khorram. This is a young adult queer contemporary novel about a young man, Darius, who is bullied at school. He suffers from depression, and one of the questions that he gets asked a lot is, why is he sad? Why is he depressed? And he doesn't really have an answer for that. He does struggle with his relationship with his father. He does struggle with the idea that he has that his sister is much younger than him and was kind of born to replace him because he's a disappointment to his family in some ways. He does struggle that he is Iranian and he doesn't really fit in with the kids at school. And then of course he's very much bullied, so he struggles with that as well. But he takes medication for his depression, and although he has all these struggles, he knows that he shouldn't feel bad about that. He's in therapy, and he knows that showing his emotions and having his emotions is a good thing, not a bad thing. Darius's mother's family still live in Iran, and Darius's grandfather is ill, so his mother decides that they have to go and visit her mother and father in Iran, and the whole family goes, and this story mostly takes place in Iran. Darius doesn't really fit in America because of his Iranian heritage, and doesn't really fit in Iran because he's American. He doesn't speak Farsi. He doesn't know a lot of the traditions. You know, that's just another thing that he's kind of feeling singled out about. So this is about him meeting his family, making friends, learning more about himself, and then his return to America. I really, really like this book. I wasn't sure at first. This is a very soft, gentle YA. So I think a lot of the YA I've read is like extremely angsty. It's very much about like teenagers knowing everything. It's all about like drama, everyday things that feel extremely dramatic. And although some of the things that happen to Darius feel dramatic, they also feel very, very real. And they are quiet things, and they are soft things, like not getting along with your dad, thinking that he's disappointed in you, not wanting to give up your childhood traditions, like watching a certain TV show or getting read a story at night, and how those transitions can be like really hard and feel really big and disheartening to a teenager. I really like Darius's character because he is like a nerd. He loves Lord of the Rings. He loves Star Trek. He really relates to the world through those things. So he calls the teapot at his job that's always too hot the name of a dragon in one of the books he loves. He loves tea. He's like a tea nerd, and he feels some of that comes from his Iranian heritage, and he uses his like fandom as a way to kind of see things in more perspective a lot of time. At his heart, Darius is like a very sweet, kind, understanding person. I wasn't sure how I felt about this book until about halfway through, and then I decided that I really, really liked it. It uses like repetition, which I think is really nice. I definitely think this is a book for younger young adults rather than like older young adults, because I do think it's so soft and gentle and sweet. My favorite aspect of this is that with that repetition, along with Darius's personality, you really see his depression in a very realistic way, like the intrusive thoughts that he has, and that he doesn't need a big dramatic thing to make him feel really bad about himself or get into a cyclical negative thought spiral, and for that depression to really overcome him really easily. Even though he can logically say this is probably not true, or I should do this, or you know, this could be the case for this, his depression really often takes over, and he can't get out of that spiraling thought process. And that's something that his dad, who also has depression, addresses with him kind of later in the book, which is interesting. I cried for the last like 70 pages, just like cried the entire time, and I'm so happy to have read it. I don't know if I'll read the second one, but I probably will, just to see what happens to Darius and see if a book where he's older deals with older teenage topics. This was on my 20 books I found out about in 2020 and I wanted to read in 2021 list, and I'm just getting to it now. Those those were 4 more books that I read in June, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is June 25th. And I have finished, I don't know, quite a few more books in June. I finished my 75th book of the year. I finished my Goodreads goal for the year with Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is her novel all within the same universe, set in the 80s, and this is about the Riva children. So they are 4 siblings, all growing up without their dad, who was a famous rock star, but growing up with their mom, who suffered from depression and alcoholism after their father left them. It follows mainly the eldest Riva sister and her life and her thoughts about life, and about a party that she throws for her siblings every year. This started as a way to celebrate the fact that they weren't totally in debt and impoverished, and has become, as the siblings get a little bit more fame and acclaim and money, a huge party that happens every year. So celebrities are there, movie stars, music producers, athletes, and Nina, the eldest sister, puts this on every year, and she's going to put it on this year despite the fact that her husband has just left her for another woman, and she really doesn't feel in the mood for a party. That's the basic premise. This book takes place all over one day and is told in dual timelines, though, where part of the story, the main part of the story, is following the Rivas during that one day, and another part of the story is telling the Riva children's backstory, so their parents' love story and then their subsequent births and etc., etc. This book was fun. I really liked it. This is the third, technically, Taylor Jenkins Reid book that I've read. First I read The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. That was set in the 60s, I believe. 60s, 70s, 80s. Yes, 60s. And it is tangentially connected with this book, as all of her later books are kind of connected. And then I also read The Evidence of an Affair, which was a very short story, an epistolary tale of people having an affair. I liked all 3 of the books that I've read by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I felt that Evelyn Hugo was like very realistic and felt very much like a real interview, and felt very much like you could be watching a movie or reading almost a true story, a true account of events. Whereas this one felt a little less realistic to me and a little bit more strained or stressed. I felt that some of the reactions of the characters were not very realistic. And although they stayed true to the characters throughout the books, I think that there were just instances where I'm like, that would not happen, and it kind of took me out of the story. I like that this book was about surfing. It seems like Taylor Jenkins Reid does like sports, because her next book, which is set in the 80s, so the one after this one, is about a tennis star. Overall, I think it was just like a super fun, perfect summer read. This one was on one of my summer TBRs one year, so I'm glad to have finally read it in the summer, and it was a fun booktube darling book to make my 75th Goodreads goal reaching book of the year. The next book that I read in June was Mr. Nobody by Catherine Steadman. This also has a super summery cover. It's a good summer feeling books, even though this actually takes place in the winter. Mr. Nobody is about a psychologist, specialist psychologist, dealing with people with memory loss and amnesia. She is working for the National Health Service, and she is in the trenches working with people every day, but she gets a call from a renowned specialist in her field asking her to take a case that he can't take, that could possibly be a fugue case where a person has actually lost all of their memory, has lost their knowledge of who they are, but not their basic knowledge of how things work, the world, how to read, how to speak, those kind of things. So she definitely wants this case, but as she looks more into it, it gets more and more bizarre. She has to go back to her hometown where something very bad happened, and she worries that she's going to have to face what she left behind when she was a teenager. So she does take the case, and she does continue to find these things, and she does meet Mr. Nobody, as the press has deemed him, and the book goes from there. This is definitely a thriller where you don't know the history of our main character, where you don't don't know the history of Mr. Nobody, and you don't know how they're going to be connected, but you know they are going to be connected. This had some interesting, thrilling moments, some spooky moments, some moments where the main character is isolated and are thrilling for the reader. I did enjoy this one. I liked the way that it was told. It was told from multiple perspectives, but mostly from our main character, and then sometimes we got perspectives from other people. I did read this one on audio. It was narrated by the author, who is a actress as well. Like, the first chapter is the man, and it goes by like the days of the case as the case is building. The next chapter is day 6, Emma Lewis, and it kind of goes back in time and talks about how she got the case. I liked that it was mostly contained to our main character, Emma, and then we only sometimes got other perspectives, because I don't love like dual perspective 1-1. I like there to be multiple chapters from each perspective that we might get in a multiple perspective book. I thought this one was silly, fun, a total romp. I enjoyed it. It was, you know, just a perfect summer thriller, just a ride, which I really liked. I'm thinking of doing a video on thrillers, kind of like I did on horror, and what works in thrillers and what doesn't, and why I think one thriller might be a fun romp and one thriller might be a dud. So if you're interested in that video, definitely let me know in the comments down below. If you're looking for a romp, I would definitely suggest Mr. Nobody. The next book that I read in June was Just Like Home by Sarah Gailey. This is a horror thriller type book, but very different from Mr. Nobody in that it is very slow build, very long, very drawn out. It's about our main character, Vera, who is going home, similar to Mr. Nobody, going back to their hometown, which they haven't been in since they were a teenager, and she is going home because her mother has called her. Her mother is dying. Vera going home to help her mother die and get the affair of the house in order is bringing up all these old subjects, how her father was not in her life after she was a teenager, and how she was kicked out of the house at 18 by her mother, and also her connection with her parents and her connection with the house that her father built. There are events that happened to Vera and her mother that led to her father not being around, and in part, Vera's mother has cashed in on those events to make a living. So there are people who come and go from the house, artists and different people who want to see the house, and Vera's really trepidatious about going back to the house to encounter any of these people. And when she goes back, it turns out that there is a artist living in the house at the time that Vera's mother has invited in, and he's really taking a lot of liberties that Vera doesn't appreciate. So it's all about Vera's relationship with her parents, relationship with the house in the past, and you find out little snippets of her past the whole time, and then also her current relationship with the house, what her expectations for coming home were, what her hopes for dealing with her mother were, and what fears she had coming back. I did like this book. This is the second Sarah Gailey book that I have read. I think she has a very plain, easy style of writing, which I think she tried to expand upon a little bit in this book and make a little bit more spooky and a little bit more flowery from the other book that I've read by her, which I don't think it didn't work, but sometimes it felt like it didn't really work. I think what this book really needed was editing. I think it could have been 50 to 100 pages shorter. It's only like 300 pages, but I don't think it needed so much of the descriptive and feeling and flowery language that was going on in it. I don't think that it necessarily improved it. And then I think also just for copy editing it needed work. There was at least one place where a line specifically contradicted another earlier line, which I think was just an editorial miss. At first I was like, well, maybe that was important and maybe that's going to come back later, but later it never happened. So I realized that it was just something that was wrong with the actual text, which I do find that in more modern books I see more and more. In the book that I'm reading now, I also have found such an editorial mistake. I don't think that this book was particularly effective in what it wanted to do. I think it definitely talks about relationships and toxic relationships and how bad people can have good relationships with people and how good people can have relationships with bad people and how people who are supposed to be your family and people who are supposed to love you aren't necessarily going to do the right thing for you. They aren't necessarily going to be the people who protect you. So I think those conversations were interesting and juxtaposed with this creepy, scary house and the idea that someplace that might be very scary for other people might be safe for some people, etc., was an interesting idea, but I don't think it necessarily was executed very well. I think this book being shorter would have helped because I think the surprises and the revelations would have been quicker paced, but also more impactful in a shorter book. I didn't hate it as much as a lot of people seem to. A lot of people seem to think it was really hokey or bad or didn't make sense or whatever. And I didn't think that. I definitely enjoyed it. I love the cover. Although I've enjoyed both Sarah Gailey books so far, I feel like I haven't found one that I've really connected with that I really loved. Those were 3 more books that I read in June, and when I read some more, I will let you know. It is June 28th, and I finished 2 more books in June. Yesterday, I finished 9 Horses by Billy Collins. This is a book of poetry by Billy Collins. He apparently was the poet laureate for the United States for a little while. I still am unclear as to what that is, what that position means, and what it entails and why people are chosen for it, but I find it interesting. This is my first Billy Collins. I found this book at the Restore in Asbury Park. I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed it more than I thought I would. I tabbed up the bottom a lot, as you can see, so I will be doing a poetry annotation video for this one. I thought his poems were interesting. They were very autobiographical, very in the moment, his thoughts, reflective, introspective, or thinking about things in society and about other people, but in a very approachable yet whimsical way. So some of his poetry was very silly, some of it was a little bit more serious, and I think it was very weirdly masculine. Not that it being masculine was weird or that it was weird and masculine, but I got a very masculine vibe from this. It reminded me a lot of the small volume of poetry that I read from Mary Oliver, where it was a little bit nature, a little bit city, a little bit people, a little bit animals, but that felt very feminine to me, and this felt very masculine to me. The humor in it felt masculine, and the observations, I guess, felt masculine, but I did enjoy this one. I look forward to finding more Billy Collins and definitely will be reading more of his work. I liked a lot of what I read in here. The next book that I finished for June was Mr. Wilson's Cabinet of Wonders by Lawrence Welcher. This was my TBR spin book for June, and it is a very short nonfiction book about the Museum of Jurassic Technology, which is a very strange little museum that existed in LA. I haven't yet researched to find out if this museum still exists or not, but it is a straightforward museum, but with a twist in that some of its exhibits are exhibits but also art pieces. This book is divided into 2 parts. It has the first part where Lawrence stumbled upon the museum one day totally randomly in LA, and it is a essay that he wrote about that I think appeared in a magazine. And then the second part of the book is kind of talking about museums of this kind, of Wunder cabinets, and the idea of how going to new places in the 1500s sparked people's imaginations. Things that they had never seen before came from other countries, from obviously colonization and destruction and stealing, but and they were really surprised and amazed by it, and this led to a movement of people wanting to see things in museums that were not just art, that were technologies from different locations, that were, you know, different fruits, different animals, different peoples, all sorts of different things that they had never encountered, and how no object was too small or uninteresting because everything was so interesting. So the second part of this book talks just about the history of that and some of the relevance of that to more modern museums and how museums of wonder kind of turned into modern museums. Specifically, they talk in here about like the Mutter Museum, which is in Philadelphia and is a museum of scientific and medical oddities and intrigues from various time periods, and how at the time when it was created that was such a new and exciting thing to look at and to see medically and just from a regular viewer's point of view. It's still totally a weird thing to see, obviously. The Museum of Jurassic Technology was much more based on technologies and different reasons why or how things came to be. One exhibit was about sonar technology and supposedly had a bat that had sonically tried to pass through a sheet of iron and got caught. Things like that. Things that are fantastical and not necessarily real, but are based on real things. But the kind of presence and point of the museum is that everything was displayed and talked about, researched, expressed to the viewer as fact, as actual happenings. And what Welcher kind of found out was that most of the things were true to some degree. So if you're interested in oddities, if you're interested in strange museums, if you're interested in the idea of science as art and art as science, I definitely would suggest reading this. It's really short, it's super easy to read. I do think that there's not a kind of final thought or final thesis that could have like rounded this book up and made it like a more solid book. I think that it needed maybe like 5 more pages of explanation, either what was happening to this museum in the future. This book was written in the 90s, or what the feelings of the author were, or what the outcome of the museum might be, or the wrap-up of the museum curator, Mr. Wilson. So like, I think it needed just a little like bow at the end, a little tightening up. As far as just like a lot of fantastical and amazing information, this is a good one. So those are 2 more books that I read in June. It is July 1st, so I'm here to talk about the last books that I read in June. I finished Agatha Christie's A Pocket Full of Rye. This is a Miss Marple book. It is the 7th in the series, I believe. I've been working through the Miss Marple series in order for the last several years. I usually read them all on audio, but I also have a physical copy of this one with a really great like 70s cover. The last Christie I read was last December for Christie's Missing Readathon, and that was a Tommy and Tuppence book. So it's been a really long time since I've read a Miss Marple book, and I was super happy to like get back into it. And the thing that always strikes me about Miss Marple is just how funny her books are. This book starts out in a secretary pool in a office building, and the secretaries are all talking. They're preparing tea for the boss, and when his secretary brings the tea in, he calls her back in and he dies of poisoning. So a inspector is brought in and he starts to investigate the death of this businessman, goes back to his family, and you know, more exciting things start to ensue. Miss Marple comes into this story very much later in the course of the events, and it's because she knows someone who was involved with the family. And of course the inspector is like, oh, you know, this batty old lady, she's not going to know anything, but she seems pretty smart, like I'll keep her around, it's fine, I won't shoo her away. Of course, Miss Marple solves the crime and the inspector is surprised. So I really loved this one. It was really, really funny. It had a lot of funny moments in it. Of course, there's like some sad moments too. This one you definitely could guess the crime, I think. Well, I don't know if you could guess the actual crimes, but you could guess the perpetrator of the crimes. In typical Christie fashion, she adds in a nursery rhyme to this one. The nursery rhyme definitely makes you think of certain people, certain suspects, certain events going on that may or may not be red herrings. And there are definitely quite a few red herring characters, but I think it was pretty easy just from like the inference of what was happening, who the criminal was. Well, I read this for Readathon, which I will talk more about in my Readathon Recap, which will be coming out shortly after this video, but I'm ready to jump back on the Agatha Christie Miss Marple train that I had been on and got off for a little while. The last book that I read in June was Acceptance by Jeff Vandermeer. This is the third in the Southern Reach trilogy and follows many of the characters from previous books, some that you followed in previous books, some that you only heard about in previous books, some that you came to know from previous books, and it is like the culmination of the Southern Reach trilogy. Although I've recently heard that maybe there's going to be another one. The three books are Annihilation, Authority, and Acceptance, and in Annihilation we meet the Southern Reach, who are a government facility researching Area X, which is an area of the world that has become unlivable and also hard to cross over its borders into. Area X is this large, possibly expanding area. No one really knows how it got there. The government has been trying to cover it up. They started Southern Reach to look over it and research it and send expeditions. So in Annihilation, we're following the 12th expedition, and we're in Area X. We're coming to understand Area X. We're experiencing Area X. In Authority, we are back at the Southern Reach. We're learning about kind of the machinations of what's going on behind the scenes. We're learning the history of potentially parts of Area X and certainly of Southern Reach. And then in Acceptance, we are back and forth in multiple timelines, looking at Area X before it was Area X, looking at Southern Reach as they were getting started, and looking at Area X as it is now. The first book, Annihilation, is definitely a horror book. It's like an eco-horror book. It's cli-fi, body horror, definitely spooky, scary, alone in the woods kind of vibes. The second book in the trilogy is all about bureaucratic horror, about the horror of being forced into things that you don't understand, being manipulated, having to research something that you don't fully understand the ramifications of. The third in the series has much more to do with the personalities involved in both those horrors and what's horrific to them, as well as all the books have some body horror, and certainly horror of metamorphosis, horror of changing, whether internally or externally. Acceptance was by far the least horrific of the three in the trilogy. Most people love Annihilation, think it was absolutely incredible, who like the series. Most people hate book 2. I loved book 2. I thought Authority was just as horrific, hit many of the same beats and cadences that the first book did, and was so creepy and had a creeping sort of dread, which I don't love, but I think worked really well in Authority. Acceptance, I find people feel like, oh, they're back into the feeling of Annihilation, they're back into the fast-paced, more horrific nature, and I really felt that Acceptance dragged a lot since it didn't have the horror, since it didn't follow the same beats as the first two books. It left me a little bit unsatisfied. I think all three books are unsatisfying in that they are not ever fully explained. You're never going to get a full explanation for any of the events in any of the books. I mean, I guess unless it's in the fourth one. But this one, to me, felt the most work for the least payoff. That being said, I really did enjoy it. I have all the books in these editions my dad got me, and I love them. I definitely plan on rereading the entire series. My first time reading this series, I specifically read them slowly. I read one book at a time over several months, which is the way I usually work with series anyway, because a lot of times things will just bleed together and I won't remember what happened in what book. But I think the next time that I read this series, I will definitely read them 1, 2, 3 right in order, and it'll just be, you know, a 900-page book or whatever, because I think it would be interesting to see, with it very fresh in your mind, the things that come up throughout the books that you maybe didn't recognize at first reading. So those were the last 2 books that I read in June. I ended up reading 13 books. I had a really good reading month. I didn't read as much queer work as I would have liked. It is Pride Month in the US and I guess all over the world, but I did read some books with queer characters and by queer authors. I read some audiobooks that were queer, and then, like, unexpectedly, Acceptance had queer characters in it. Malibu Rising had queer characters in it, so I was able to read some. As far as diversity goes, I did read some books by people of color, which is great, but I did read a lot of books by white authors this month, which, you know, is not really my favorite. I was looking through my statistics, and it looks like I have outweighed white authors to authors of color, so I'm hoping to get back to a better balance in July. You know, it all washes out probably at the end of the year, but hopefully that'll happen. I read a book of poetry. I read some mystery thrillers. I read some horror. I read a YA that surprised me. Overall, I had a really great reading month. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I mentioned here. Let me know if you enjoyed them. Look out for my Readathon Recap, where I talk about what readathon these books fit into. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!